Today, I'm so grateful that on this beautiful day, you've taken the time to come together. And a key part of this coming together is to carry on the conversation that endures even far beyond this. Part of my goal in coming here today is to be a catalyst or a helper along the way in addressing the real challenges and not shirking from them within our communities. What's helpful is knowing that this is not just your problem. I was going to joke that this is now the 15th community that said, you know, our situation is totally unlike anyone else. The truth is that there are many things that are in common, and there are many things that rhyme. And so you have a specific application of particular challenges, but the truth is that we can help each other to deeply understand what does it take to create places that are strong and resilient and have within them the ability to endure. When Strong Towns first was established, Chuck Marone, who's the founder and president of Strong Towns, was writing about all of the things that we were doing that were, one, driving him crazy, and two, making our places weak and fragile. Making them in the long term functionally insolvent. And a friend came along and said, you know, what we need are strong towns. We can't have weak and fragile ones. So no matter the size or the population of our communities, we have to grapple with the fact that the current prevailing pattern of development that we've inherited from our recent ancestors since the end of the Second World War, largely, is making our places weak and fragile. And so with the courage or boldness of an advocate, or maybe the idiocy of someone that should know better, we seek to change that. We seek to take on very entrenched interests and those that have a real vested interest in making sure that the thing that works right now is going to work just a little bit longer, go a little bit further. In the context of this, we had one writer that said, you know, we're living in the midst of an intergenerational dine and dash. An intergenerational dine and dash where a significant bill has been rung up, and much like me going to a restaurant and enjoying a couple bottles of wine and a nice dessert and really enjoying the quality of a great dining experience, which is akin to what many of our residences and our neighbors have really experienced in a lot of our great communities. But in so doing, we have rung up a significant tab. And it would be the equivalent of me then stepping out and saying, hey, when my son comes back, 15 years from now with his first date, he'll pay the rest of the bill. I'll pay 15, he'll cover the rest of the tab. And that is the challenge that we face. And as Pete alluded to, this is not the consequence of a single person or a single visionary that has created these conditions, but the reality or the challenge that you face in your community. This is from the city's own presentations of the challenges, the financial imbalances that it is currently dealing with. We see that the long-term structural gap from fiscal year 2025 onwards, going forward into a 10-year gap, is significant. Feels not insurmountable, because we know that change is definitely possible, and we know that we can help our communities in this way, but it's a serious, pressing challenge. And what we'll talk about is the fact that actually it is a consequence of really leaning into a development pattern that works for a while until it doesn't. At Strong Towns, we call this the illusion of wealth, in that the suburban pattern of development was highlighted by the sense that everybody was doing well. The trouble is, in the near term, that is true, but in the longer term, that has become more difficult. I think hopefully you can see, these are city slides, that's why the text is so small. The rest of the text is going to be a lot larger. Fewer charts, fewer graphs, all of that good stuff. And so our message at Strong Towns is very, in a sense, a little sad, a little upsetting. That our current path, meant as a means of securing prosperity for all, has unwittingly trapped us in a system that is incapable of building lasting prosperity. And so if you ever come across somebody that say, I'm Strong Towns, they're trading in this. They're recognizing these challenges. And therefore, we're actually looking to say, how do we begin to address the problem that we've created for ourselves? At Strong Towns, we say that problems have solutions, but the predicament that we're in is one where we need to it's much more than just a singular problem. We're in a predicament, and these predicaments have various outcomes. The Calvinist in me says we need to make things just a little less worse. Or another way to say, we need to try to do many things to address the outcomes so that the outcomes are a little bit better than they otherwise might have been. And so out of this, one of the things that I'll lay out, and then we'll go into more of the specifics for Pacifica and talk housing in particular as it relates to the creating of strong communities versus weaker ones. And in that context, one of the challenges that we see is after the advent of the whole economic engine that was the suburban development pattern going across the United States, across Canada as well, after the end of the Second World War, you saw policy and subsidies and highway expansion and all of these helping to create a very simple method of building out cities. Rinse and repeat, copy and paste over and over and over again. And we saw this in the remarkable ingenuity of being able to turn around and 2 years later have a brand new city or brand new entire swath of a community established. And yet the challenge was that this would come at a considerable expense, but not only that, it represented a change of focus. Rather than recognizing that cities are complex, they are adaptable, they're much more like, or they're much like organic creatures rather than simple machines. Instead, the post-war pattern of development said, we could probably do what the assembly line did for cars, what we can do with our cities. And so you see very clear standards, really clear ordinances. You see Greenlee County in Arizona copying and pasting parking requirements from mega cities. So that way, if ever you go to Greenlee, it's a two-bit place in the middle of Arizona, they have standards if they have buildings over 20 stories of how much parking they're going to require. Because they've taken the same assembly line approach and simply took those standards and used them. And so it made it very predictable. The difficulty is that it also lacked that complexity and the adaptability that we need. I want to tell you just a brief sort of historical story to demonstrate this. This is the community of Brainerd, Minnesota, but if I didn't tell you that, you wouldn't have known which one it was, but you would think, oh, that looks vaguely historically or maybe even a little bit familiar. This is how most of our communities were established as Western settlement was taking place across the Western frontier. You would see simple investments of resources, a simple bet to make something of very little, and to create the conditions for human settlement. And to create through the conditions of human settlement, opportunity through proximity. That's the key here. They had room for days in so many areas. They could have built large, sprawling sort of areas, and yet they chose very consciously, just as human instinct, to cluster buildings together. This was on the banks of the Mississippi River. There were opportunities to have boats stop every foot along the Mississippi, and yet they said, no, we need a settlement. We need to create a town. We need to create this opportunity. And by having it succeed, as more investment came in, more opportunities came in, you see within 24 years, a significant thickening up of those initial investments. You would begin to replace a lot of what previously existed and begin to improve upon it. This was complex adaptation. This was not master planned. This was not selling a sales brochure saying, hey, once you move here, things won't change. This was just the normal human settlement pattern that we see not only in North American cities, but you can see these same tendrils across Latin America. You can see it throughout Africa. We see it in so many other places. Not every city would look exactly the same as this, but the key insight is that these simple, modest bets would then be followed by more significant private investment. And with that, the corresponding benefit to the community that emerged from more activity was you began to get more public works. You would begin to say as residents, as shopkeepers, as owners, hey, what if we went together in on sidewalks? What if we went together in on very basic paving of our streets? Beginning to provide, even just a couple of decades later, in-ground sewage and water to be able to provide for those things, but it followed from the thickening up of communities. And if you've not heard of Brainerd, that's totally fine, because this pattern is normal across the United States until the end of the Second World War. Then we simply said, what if we can get away from all of this complex adaptation? You can see how that street is beginning to extend, and the community is beginning to encroach on areas where smaller, simpler structures were built. Those were being replaced over time. This is the story of Pacifica, simple beach shacks being replaced with slightly more substantial homes, and then over time, a few of them being replaced with apartment buildings or opportunities for more people to be able to live here, for people to meet their needs. In some cases, it was, I have family members coming from another country, so I'm gonna build an additional unit in the backyard to be able to provide for them, and that was normal. It was complex, it was occasionally messy, it was the opposite of growing through predictable, repeatable patterns, and yet the pattern that we see here actually was creating lasting prosperity. Now, if this wasn't Brainerd, you would think that this could be many of our communities. This is what it is today. And the first thing, if I'm the public works engineer, I'm like, oh, what a beautiful street. And oh, better sidewalks. And hallelujah, they've actually got proper street lighting. But if I look at it from the perspective of a strong citizen, I say, where is the wealth needed to take a fraction of that wealth that's being produced by this land in order to be able to justify the amount of public expense here? And we have done this to ourselves by continuing to roll out extensive services, significant outlays of public funds to generate so little in returning investment. To have knocked down vital, economically beneficial buildings and structures rather than repairing them and renewing them or even building upon them, instead just being like, what if we leveled more of that? The great benefit in my city is the vast majority of what was in our downtown area in the urban renewal scheme. That was, I love that they used the word scheme back in 1960, but in the scheme they said the vast majority of the buildings here are blighted. And as a result, they were all destined for destruction. And I thank the Lord Almighty that we didn't have money to knock them down. And as a result, they still are there, and they're still so vital in our community, and some are being improved upon. We're seeing additional stories being added to them, but they're still part of it rather than removing everything that made our places vital and strong. And so this is the challenge that a lot of our places face, is that we traded patterns of development that were more capable for patterns of development that are very extractive, still require a lot of street frontage, still require a lot of sidewalk, and yet lack the ability to generate lasting prosperity. And Pacifica is challenged by this. Pete made mention of the fact that you have a very or not necessarily distorted, but a significant ratio of residences compared to the number of smaller businesses and other types of retail and commercial structures that you might have in your city. The truth of it is that at the core, you just need your land to earn its keep. People to be able to provide from their ability to generate wealth from any given site in your community. I would say, depending, no matter what your taxes are, or I mean, whatever your political views are, you will always accept that a fraction of your own private wealth can be taken for the work of the commonwealth that we do together. That's what a city is. It's a cooperative enterprise. We call it a corporation for that reason. A cooperative enterprise to take from everyone, for everyone, to the benefit of everyone. And so we know that we are going to need a significant amount of private capacity to be able to provide for public capacity. And this is the challenge that we have. If you're wondering, well, what about Brainerd? Brainerd now is what it's become. So maybe that's just what was inevitable, that you would have a boom and then you would have a bust and then you just get sites like this. Well, this is, I'll give you a moment to see if you can identify where this is. This is 1878. Again, simple public investment in the infrastructure, but a lot of private activity, a lot of private wealth being generated here. 1898, they've started to improve the streets with streetcars. They're making investments in the public realm, but it's matched with the recognition that the private realm is able to do more with the land and therefore justify a more public investment in those spaces. 1911, preparing for in the midst of war, and you can see, again, this work of building up the capacity of our places. And we think of these places almost as unicorns, as if our great cities emerged sort of by magic, and we can't replicate that. We don't need to have the same scale, but we can certainly begin to see the same economic vitality. This is recognizable, and yet the pattern is one that we disrupted in so many more communities. And had we continued on this path, we would have many more, maybe not of the size of New York City or San Francisco, but we would have many more places that were very economically vibrant. Even as major industries had to leave or other opportunities dwindled away, there would still be, through the careful use of public resources, the ability to provide a platform for building a lot of private wealth and prosperity. But we took a very different path in the post-war era. And it was especially out of the White House Office for Economics. Paul Samuelson, who's a prominent economist in 1943, said, if the war were to end suddenly, in the middle of Second World War, if the war were to end suddenly, we are going to face the largest period of dislocation, unemployment, and collapse of our economy because we've stopped creating munitions. We've stopped creating tanks. We need to get people to work. We need to get people to do something useful as they come back from the wartime front. And so they said, let's put them to use building neighborhoods. And a massive post-war building boom emerged out of this, subsidized by massive amounts of public outlay for highways and other major nation-building projects. But the consequence of it looks a little like what we see in Fresno. 1897, I'm not picking on Fresno, as we just have maps for them, and it's helpful to see this illustrated. If you go to Fresno today, chances are pretty good if you go to this core, the reason you would go there is because there's activity taking place there. There's little shops, there's lots of participants, there's many different hands that have continued to shape the core of the community. By 1909, you were beginning to see greater horizontal expansion of the city, but at the same time, they were also doing the work of thickening up those buildings. Those first buildings built in 1897, some of them were already being renovated by 1909. Others were being replaced as more substantive structures, replaced ones maybe that burned or that were needed to be improved in one way or another. We see this complex adaptation underway. 1922, into 1934, even during the midst of the Great Depression, you see this gradual outward expansion, but crucially, if we were to survey the Sanderson fire maps that tell the story of these buildings over the decades, you would see that a significant amount of the actual activity in the city would have been happening still within its core. In the areas where services were being provided, quality of life was improving as more participants came to participate in what was going on. 1946, you see that there's still been more outward expansion, but crucially, much of that activity is in helping the city itself to mature, to make better use of things like streets and pipes and fire service and schools and community centers, to really add to the number of participants who are making use of these good services. And then we see the entrance of the suburban pattern of development. Remember at the outset I said this is a pattern of development that is making our places weak and fragile. And I want to quantify what that looks like because it has direct relevance to Pacifica. By 1958 into 1970, you begin to see this broad outward expansion, this race to do so, and simultaneously in this era, no or virtually no investment in the core. No more investment in those areas, instead an emptying out of those places and abandoning of all of that vital public infrastructure to simply say, what if we built more of it to a brand new state out in the suburbs and not have to worry about whatever goes on in the places that are a little messier, a little more chaotic, a little more participating in the hands of many people improving these places. And so by 1983, you can see the broad outward expansion of the city with very little in the way of a thickening up of any of these places. Vast swaths of single detached only housing with the idea that this is what sells, this is what everybody needs, this is what's bankrupting our city in the longer term. But that wasn't known then, or at least that wasn't clearly made evident. By 2010, and we don't have, I need to go find the maps for 2020, but you can see that broad reaching out of the city. And one of the challenges, this is not Fresno, but this is San Antonio, is we asked the question, where then, if we've done all of this work to provide public infrastructure and services, has it resulted in a corresponding tax base that justifies that level of public investment? And in San Antonio, you can see very clearly, you don't have to be a geography wizard to figure out where the downtown is. You don't have to be a geography wizard or a history wizard to tell me where the city's core was and where it developed before the war and after the war. The areas that are the low spikes, this is a heat map, the low areas are the suppressed areas where there's not a very high amount of public investment in order to justify public investment to go and make those spaces available. And yet, you can see that this is the pattern that San Antonio adopted widespread throughout its boundaries. We can see this very quantified then in places like Kansas City or South Bend, Indiana. In a time of significant population decrease between 1960 and 2020, you can see the massive increase in public obligations. And the public obligations come when you have just a few houses on a block requiring sewage, requiring force main, requiring lift stations, rather than more households. It's a very simple thing. If you have more participants willing to pay more for the services that are needed, you can then justify a greater amount of service being provided. But instead, we doubled down on a pattern that does not have the capacity for this, because we said, no, we need to space our buildings out. We need to create great broad streets. We need to do all of this work. And the consequence in Kansas City is a 1.8 times increase in population, people who pay taxes or will one day when they grow up and get a job, as well as 27 times more feet of sewer pipe per person. So each new baby, when they're greeted in the hospital, is given the little pink toque or the little blue toque and 27 feet of sewer pipe per person. Not exactly what everybody anticipates as the thing that we should be providing to each resident in our community. And it'd be really interesting to see the numbers in Pacifica as well. Back in the day when this was a modest community comprised of beach shacks, a much smaller population, to ask the question on a public infrastructure basis, what was being provided at that time in comparison to the number of residents? And now, how many roads do you have? How many pipes do you have? Let me go back to here. This is San Antonio, Texas. Again, I was there not too long ago. I love this illustration. San Antonio does a lot of things well. One of the things they've done really well is build a lot of roads. Enough to have single lane roads take you all the way to Las Vegas by way of New York. Now, there are some things that it's best to be number one at. And they're not even number one. There are cities that have even more roads. But in San Antonio, it was the realization, this is maybe not a point of pride if we have to keep it up, if we have to pay to maintain it, if we are obliged to be responsible, not just now, but going forward for all of this. The big kicker, 707 miles of stormwater pipe that could take them all the way to Memphis if they were to stretch it out in a single go. And so in this, we asked the question, how did it get to be like this? And it got to be like that by doing horizontal development without any requisite thickening up of your existing neighborhoods, creating great little town centers, population areas where more activity can occur to justify the amount of public investment that's gone into it. And so the consequence that we see here in Pacifica is that you have a pattern of development where very little thickening or maturing has been allowed to happen. It isn't that property owners haven't been willing. Some of them right now are not willing to redevelop the site. They're waiting for opportunities to come. But over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, there have certainly been proposals in some of your core areas to better provide in the private realm, the activity that would then justify spending money on public expenses. And instead what we did is we imposed a lot of blanket bans, we imposed a lot of stringent requirements, and we did the same thing in our residential neighborhoods as we've done in our commercial areas. And the consequence of this is that we lack the economic vitality to justify the amount of public investment that we've committed to making. We have community centers that need to be re-roofed, and we struggle to know where to find money for it unless we can hold out a hat to higher levels of government. We say we don't have any funds available for a really robust road maintenance program or replacement of our sewer pipes as we go along. And yet, even within it, if we go and take a look, and I'll show examples from other places, but I was noting you have some of these smaller little sites that are economic gems in terms of their ability to generate value in the community. These don't have to be lovely. Actually, the sushi spot is probably awesome, but the reality is this doesn't have to be a big box store. It doesn't have to be a power center. This is a really efficient use of land. And it also unlocks the added value of having many different participants, many different hands participating in making their community stronger. By and large, when we do the math on a per acre basis for sites like this, they will be 5 to 10 times as valuable on a per acre basis as your larger stores, as your larger complexes, even your office parks and that sort of stuff. And that is how we generate value within our communities. I'll show a little bit more about this. I was flummoxed in trying to get the numbers specifically for Pacifica today. I kept trying to find it, and probably someone from the city is able to say, you should have used GIS in a slightly different way, and I would have unlocked it. What I was looking for was parcel info about the assessed value of each parcel in Pacifica, and then I like to do a spot check of each of them, and then the amount of acreage required to hold that amount. So say the property is worth $1.4 million, and it's on a 0.11 acre site, then we can calculate the value per acre of that particular site to be able to compare apples to apples, or sort of much like we do with vehicles, we use a miles per gallon comparison to see how much input is required to get a certain output. And that's what we should be having in the context of how much building do we require and how much land do we require to get a corresponding 1 million or 2 million or 3 million. And so, forgive me, I'm going to use a West Coast example from Mount Vernon, Washington. Their numbers are not quite so crazy, so that's part of what makes it a little bit easier. Imagine being able to buy a 0.17 acre site. I think its sale price is less than $1 million. In Vancouver, we can't even buy a house for that amount. But you've got a very simple structure right in their downtown area, right in the traditionally developed downtown. And it comes in at $5 million per acre. And I also included the amount of property tax. Washington is a sales tax state as well, but they get a portion of revenue to the city. And Pacifica relies quite heavily on property tax here, so it's very relevant in that context, at $53,000 an acre on an annual basis. Just up the street is the food co-op. Bunch of hippies selling rutabagas, and on a 0.22 acre site, so double the size of the site, but it has a significant more value because it comes in at $12 million per acre is the assessed value of that particular site if you do it on a per acre basis. But then if we begin to change the development pattern, we have parking spaces in a lot of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, perfect. Much better. We also have a little bit of space. We've even sort of stretched it out just a little bit. And in that context, we can do that, but it comes at a cost because now we begin to see our value on a per acre basis begin to drop. If you use that 0.11 acres in a much less efficient way, not by having a second story, and if these people were to propose adding a second story, imagine the amount of regulatory barriers that they would face even to do a simple, modest addition to what they have there. But in this context, this cleaner is at $2.4 million per acre, or $26,000 an acre in annual property tax. Pacifica is grappling with this, and I wish I had your numbers, but I don't, so I'm giving you Mount Vernon. Again, now this building here, right in the middle by the van, they've done what the suburban pattern of development said is even better. To keep people from congesting your main street, have all the cars come off the street. So not even pull in parking, get them off. So you can go in behind, you can park back there. And so on 0.17 acres, you see the reduction in the value per acre. But then the new stuff. New's better. We figured it out. We have smart people with MBAs that have told us car dealerships generate a lot of property tax a lot of sales tax. So if we can get like 80 of these and become auto row, then we will really have landed. The trouble is, it's a very inefficient use of that land, and it requires significantly, notice one of the things too, watch as these images come through, how much public investment you can sort of roughly calculate, the width of the roads, the obligation to provide more and more infrastructure in these sites. Yes, they have really nice landscaping up front, but they are not contributing even as much as this little dry cleaner. And then we go and we change the development pattern just a little bit further. We say, what if we gave, you get an acre, but you from Bentonville get 22. To use a 20 or 27 acre site comes in at only $945,000 an acre and only bringing in $11,000 an acre in annual property tax. And if we were to look at it, at times we can be challenged by this. And Strong Towns has been trying to gently but pointedly make this clear. When the folks in Bentonville hop in their private jet and fly to Mount Vernon, they drop a bag of $327,000 in property taxes. And the city clerk is bowing, and everybody is, handing them, their gift baskets, and they're, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Meanwhile, the hippie shows up and he drops $30,000 on the desk, and they're like, well, thanks, moving on. Here comes the dry cleaner. They're dropping off their money. They're doing all of these sorts of things. But we asked the question, if you were to use the Walmart site in an equally efficient manner, what would you be getting? As in, how much money are we leaving on the table by doubling down on a pattern of development that actually yields a lot less, as we saw in the amount of property tax on a per acre basis that we get? If the Walmart land use pattern was changed to be more like the co-op, its total assessed value would be in the range of 280 to 325 million. You would have significantly more to tax, significantly more to draw upon in order to justify the amount of public realm that you were using. In Mount Vernon, I took their downtown area, and that's the part in blue, and that's that 27 acres. And I didn't have the time to do an analysis of each of the lots, but if you were to add them all up, almost certainly the total would be nearer to $325 million with the corresponding amount of property tax coming into the city. And this is what that looks like to all of our places. And we actually can see this in the same way in residences. On the residential side, though, I'm always careful. I always say, if I were to show you the residences, then I'd have to flee quickly because people don't like this to be pointed out. But the truth is that we're not asking for radical change. We're just asking, can we start to build like we used to? Can we create communities that resemble a little bit more the older villages that were commonplace across the North American landscape? Can we allow more fine-grained urbanism? It might mean having buildings just a little bit closer together. It might mean having buildings up to the street, but that's actually how we generate lasting value in our communities. That's how that little threeplex of small businesses can generate so much value in your community, and yet oftentimes we say, but wouldn't it be nice if we had an Olive Garden? Actually, this is what we lose when we take that gamble. In this case, $327,000, excellent. You think, okay, that sustained us. That paid for 4 police officers this year. But you miss the opportunity of collected all the other value, all of the other resources that are needed in the community. I said I won't always show residences, but we can see this. This is in the city of Medicine Hat, a single family lot on 2nd Street, right in their downtown area. This was the traditional development pattern. So they had this as a normal, commonplace thing that you would have single detached houses next to duplexes. And that duplex was significantly more productive on a per acre basis, though you had now 2 households contributing property taxes, which actually means that they are individually paying less, but collectively contributing more. And then on that same space, you also have a small, little, simple, modest walk-up retail store with residences on the top, and you can see the significant increase, and they're all on the same street. That was normal. That is messy. That was in a lot of our codes now, we talk about prior non-conforming uses. If that poor building there, if the print shop in it suddenly went on fire and it was destroyed, most of our planning documents would say, oh, well, it's got to be a single detached house. But what do we give up when we do that? What conditions do we create? And again, this is not asking for major 5/1 sort of big concrete structures to be established in our communities, but it is at the core of what Strongtown says, which is that no neighborhood should be subject to radical change. And I would say arguably none of this, it represents a radical change, especially if you see the pattern repeating itself in various places. But at the same time, no neighborhood should be exempt from change. There should be the readiness that in time it would feel normal for the owner of that single family house to receive offers from somebody that said, hey, I'm interested in putting up a triplex. I'm interested in adding a little bit of extra complexity, a little bit of extra activity in the neighborhood, and this will be to the benefit of the community. And if you're concerned about housing affordability, it will actually result in units that are cheaper eventually, not when they're first bought. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis did a study of houses bought across their whole domain. They're responsible for Wyoming and Montana and North Dakota, so places that their house prices have not yet reached the levels they have here. And their study said the household income of the person who first buys a home is almost without exception the highest it will ever be. And you can see this across all of our housing stock, except for maybe the most exclusive mansion districts. that the household income of the person that buys it first is going to be highest, and we see this on the car lot. If I go to the Toyota dealership, I buy my 2008 Toyota Corolla from the person that previously owned it, and they're almost certainly better off than me. But that's fine, because what I need is their seconds. What I need is their thirds. And this is the conditions that we said, what if we don't have this in our neighborhoods? What if we simply say you can build your neighborhood all at once to a finished state, the public will provide all of the infrastructure to make it habitable, and then we will freeze it and leave it as is. And I deeply, I'm in British Columbia. We have allowed now up to 4 units on any given residential lot across the province. And so I'm sympathetic to, but also observing what's happening in California with various requirements to begin to allow the introduction of new forms of housing within your existing communities. And for a lot of people, it's a significant change. For a lot of people, it feels disruptive, it feels jarring. If you've only ever had the right, the introduction of the things on the left feels like this alien invasion, and yet part of our message at Strong Towns is maybe we need to take a second look at why we would consider allowing mixed neighborhoods, allowing maturing neighborhoods to gradually thicken up, to be improved upon over time by the ingenuity of people that aren't necessarily always going to build the building that you prefer, but are going to build things that work for their community, build value within the spaces. And we touch on this in the context of what we call a release at Strong Towns called the Housing Ready Toolkit. It's 6 steps for cities to be able to probe their own local code. One of the challenges, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. A lot of our places, we have a map of places that have said, hey, we have already taken significant progress on 5 or 6 of these steps. And we're making steps to be open to local investment. Not multinational investment, not the real estate investment trust. They have a role to play, but it's often not in our smaller communities, especially in our emerging communities. But these are the places where you allow and equip a local landowner to do a little bit more with their property. I want to tell you a quick story. In my community, I wrote an article about this on the Strongtown site. We had a woman, she came to our local, we have a group called Deltons for People-Oriented Places. And Nancy is her name, and she said, hey, I need you to hear my story. And I was like, all right. And she said, I owned a single detached house, and it was on my property, and it was valued at about $1 million. That's BC housing prices for you. And in that context, she said, I was living there with my cat, and my niece was priced out of the market. She had some equity, and her partner had some equity, but they couldn't find anything except a significant driving distance away, and they didn't want that. And she said, so I sold them 50% of my property, and due to this really peculiar loophole in our building code, they were able to build for her a little backyard cottage that she perfectly designed for herself to be able to age in place. And meanwhile, her niece was able to live in the main house. Nancy was suddenly cash flow positive because she had returned from her investment in her property from decades ago. But she also was able to provide necessary housing. She said, I have somebody to water my plants. And the curiousness of it was that it was because, basically, imagine if this was the house, that when they had poured the foundation, they had over-poured. And so she had a very clever housing designer that said, if you build right on this corner and extend this way, we can count it as attached. And so this silly little loophole let her do the thing that so many of her senior friends said, how did you do that? I wish I could do that. We've now started to make that possible. We've now started to make it possible to build detached structures on existing properties and improve upon them. The other core thing that we talk about at Strong Towns is we need to be able to adapt existing structures more effectively. We need to be able to take building stock that's already earned its keep, it's been there for decades, and be able to put a secondary unit into a garage, create the conditions in which additional people live in there. And this is where I want to pause, because I've heard a number of times people say, we don't have transit here, everybody has to drive. As a result, we shouldn't do anything, or we should do very little. One of the things that we've done is worked with there's a city council member in Edmonton, Alberta. Her master's thesis was on garden suites or backyard cottages within the city of Edmonton. You can walk here. Edmonton is not a place to walk, a nice place to walk in the winter. But in that context, she said, how many of the units that are being occupied are being rented at market rates or below? And the vast majority of them were seriously below market rates, or they were being provided free to family members. Simultaneously, these backyard cottages were also, I think it's 60% of them didn't have a vehicle. Because people's socioeconomic statuses actually reflected the fact that they were unlikely to need and rely upon a vehicle as their primary means of transportation. And there are a lot more people like that. A lot more people that are willing to make a lifestyle decision to work from home, to be able to walk to some of the things that they need and use temporary access to vehicles, ride share, as well as car co-ops or other things like that. Those things can be introduced and incentivized by communities who say, maybe we can begin to thicken up and let our neighborhoods mature without assuming that everybody has to be in a in an SUV on the highway. There are three things, though, that the suburban pattern of development is really marked by. And we have to grapple with each one of these three. The first is strategic exclusion by class or status. It's in the documents themselves, the idea that you can create the neighborhood of your choosing, and the nice thing is it won't be messy. It won't be chaotic, and it'll be people like you. We can see this in Connecticut, where they have minimum lot sizes of, up until recently, an acre. So that way, people had to meet a certain capital threshold in order to be able to buy there. We can see this in the designation of vast swaths as light residences, or the idea of low-density residential being something that allows many people to be kept away. Ask if somebody wants an apartment next to you, and if they recoil, an element of that is a deeply ingrained sense that there must be something wrong if somebody lives in a smaller space. And yet we have significantly changed our society by turning back from the idea of past generations, millennia of human experience where the wealthy and the poor have lived much closer together than currently we see today. And the longer term implications of this is that our children can't afford to live where we live, our servants can't afford to live where we live. And yes, I know it's impolite to call people that work in retail your servants, but we've taken on this mindset. We can bring in people from afar and make them do the dirty work or the low skill work, and then we get to have our perfect neighborhoods. And so if we have strategic exclusion by class or status woven into our documents, we can see this in the founding sort of planning documents of many of our communities. It's very overt in the council testimony from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. My group in Delta, we started because I was struggling with the fact that as a renter, we had a public hearing on removing restrictions on rentals. And one of the first commenters said, well, renters are, many of them are criminals. And one of the ways that we've tried to cope with this, I can assure you, I have a terrible track record, and I'm not a criminal. I swear, I promise. I'm Canadian. We don't have jails. But out of it was just this deep sense we can't have others near us. And now my point as a pastor is I would then take out the word of the Lord, and we'd have a sermon about loving your neighbor. But at Strong Towns, we've realized that we can't actually persuade everyone that way. And so if you're put off or if you're challenged right now, you might say, I hear you, but you're ignoring other convenient facts. Well, then let's talk about the economic performance of our places. Let's talk about the long-term viability of our communities. Let's talk about the gradual thickening up of our places so that way when a pipe costs more to replace today than when we first put it in, there is more today to cover the cost than there was when we first put it in. My city is putting sidewalks into existing suburbs where those suburbs have not changed a lick since 1970, when all of that first capital was absorbed to create that neighborhood, that subdivision in the first place. The trouble is that sidewalk is extra, and the extra cost of the pipes to improve them is significantly more than it was when it first went in. The streets cost more to maintain, and yet we're relying on less of a base to be able to justify our spending on this. And so when we look to improve a road, we need to make sure that we've also set in motion the conditions for the neighborhood itself to improve. Not just escalate in home price, but escalate in capacity. Escalate in the ability of more participants to cover the costs of what we need in our places. And this is where I had a conversation with an older gentleman from Wisconsin named Tim, and he said, he left a message. Some of you will appreciate this probably by this point in the talk. He said, is Strong Town's a cult? And I called him back and I was like, I need to have this conversation. And he said, are you a cult? Because I have been noticing that I was a builder and a contractor for decades in Wisconsin. And in that context, we did very simple, modest projects in our communities. We were constantly going out and helping farmers build structures. We would help the municipality if they needed a little pump shed. He said, my son took over my business, and now all of the contracts that they get are federally funded or bond funded for the municipalities. They're doing the coolest community centers in the middle of Wisconsin. They are doing really impressive sewage treatment plants that are over-engineered to last for decades to come. And he said, but I have this nagging sense that on the one hand, it's great that he's making money, but on the other hand, who's going to pay for this? And we have lost sight, he said, of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. And the cult question he had was kind of a check on him. He said, I've been feeling this way for a long time, but Strong Towns is helping me to articulate this. But I need to know, like, is there more that I need to worry about my wife or my bank account or, like, you know, my long-term well-being? And I said, no, you're fine. This is, in so many respects, we have many people in our communities who are Strong Towns before Strong Towns ever came along. We have city managers that have been holding the line on these types of things. Oh, and I realized I also forgot my other two elements of the suburban pattern. One, so if the first one is strategic exclusion by class or status, and there's a whole host of actual real-life financial implications to doing that. The second layer of it is the assumption or the resistance to change. We have realtors in our community that sell, right now they were recently selling 360-degree views in a 10-story tower that they were building. Great. The only thing is, those same realtors know that phase 2 is currently under approval, and that's going to be right next door for a 12-story tower. And so at least they are going to be told you were wrong. But a lot of our suburban patterned neighborhoods have baked in them the idea that we can basically resist most change and we'll be fine. Our children won't be fine, they have to leave. Other people that are looking for an opportunity are not fine. And when it comes time for everybody to pass around a hat to cover the cost of public infrastructure, or when it comes time for Pacifica to balance its budget, we're going to deeply struggle, but at least we didn't have to change. And then the third element is the assumption of auto-dependency. The assumption of auto-dependency as the beginning and the end point characterizes the suburban pattern. And it is the recognition that the automobile has a vital role in the North American landscape, absolutely. But if we make all of our decisions from the prospect and the premise that every shopping trip requires ample free parking, every residence requires ample free parking for Thanksgiving Day when you bring the whole family over, if our malls need to have parking that surpasses the expectations that we have for how many people are going to show up on Black Friday, what do? We over-index on automobile infrastructure. We over-index on automobile infrastructure, and it is extremely costly to do so. What we can do with simple things like pathways to connect communities in tens of thousands of dollars, if we were to try to do it for vehicles, is going to be hundreds, if not millions of dollars. We see this in the continued expansion of the highway system. Santa Clarita down in LA area, they added 3,000 new homes in a large master plan. I want to meet the master because his plans are not always so good. But the master plan community, 3,000 new homes. Not a stick of retail, not a stick of office. Yeah, you can work from home, but you have to meet certain standards. And your primary access to the community to get what you need in Santa Clarita, the I-5. And along comes the governor as well as the Department of Transportation. They say, you can read about their North County traffic improvement plan. And their primary reason for adding additional lanes to the I-5 is to allow for the improvement of traffic or the addition of traffic. The bringing in of the assumption of auto-dependency into all of these things. And this has significant consequences on why Pacifica doesn't have great public transit. It has significant implications on why we, for example, with many of our streets are not willing to allow them to be slowed. I would say don't call it traffic calming, just call it opening it up, making it suitable for more people to enjoy it. I want to get a sticker for the back of my car that says I'm a neighborhood pace car. Because if you drive slow in your neighborhood, you're increasing your property values. If you get everybody else in your neighborhood to drive slow, it certainly increases the property values. We can see this. And so what if we're all our pace cars? You'll have to deal with some rabid folks, but we'll get through it. And so what is the problem of a city? Jane Jacobs, who's the patron saint of Strong Towns, she doesn't know it, she's dead now, but we love her. Her comment is that cities are organized complexity. and not just problems of simplicity. Especially when you've got people in the 1960s, the 1970s, they put people on the moon. They figured out mass vaccinations. They were able to stop polio. They're figuring out what to do with malaria. There are a lot of things that we've found solutions to. And the idea is, what if we take the same approach and apply that to the work of just doing cities? And so if you have a good pattern in one city, you go and repeat it over and over and over again, which is where we see a lot of projects with Texas architects that are doing the exact same thing there as here. And people are like, what about the local vernacular? Can it look like a coastal community? It's like, nope, because we've already got the plans drawn up. We've done it in 18 other communities, and you would be a fool to say no to this. This is the change that we have that we so need to contend with. Well, another challenge that we have, I'll share this, probably you'll side with the city on this, but I applied for when I was stepping back from pastoral ministry for family reasons, I was applying to my city to be our director of communications. And I said, look, our Instagram feed and our press releases and all of the stuff that we do is always like, isn't Delta awesome? Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it great? We just open things, we've just improved things, everything is great. If you've ever watched a Lego movie with children or yourself, maybe you get a kick out of it, there's an everything is awesome song. In that context, I said, we need bad news Thursdays, or we need like tough talk Fridays. We need to actually demonstrate to people what the real consequences of decay and struggle are. And this is where I want to highlight what the city of Pacifica is doing and boldly identifying we have serious funding shortfalls. We have serious challenges that we need to face. And I just realized I'm going to go for another 10 minutes or so, but I want to share what Pete mentioned in terms of a calculator. This is what I'm going to show you. Only a handful of graphs, so bear with me. At Strong Towns, one of the things that we've been asking is, how do we know that we're actually struggling? How do we see and make visible the trade-offs that are occurring and the deeper, longer-term systemic challenges that we face? And the equivalent of the government finance officers of America, the equivalent of that in Canada, came up with 7 indicators of financial sustainability for cities. And these are simple ratios that you can take from your published reports that each city reports on each year, and you can ask the question, how sustainable are our cities over the longer term? And so I took the annual comprehensive financial report for the city of Pacifica from 2018 all the way up to 2024. These are published on the website. One of their challenges, and this is according to the book, the way that you're supposed to do it, is that they each year report 2 years, this year and last year. And so we said, what if we put the numbers together and string them together over the course of a number of years? If I had access to more of the ACFRs, I could do that for a longer period of time. I was just down in San Francisco and did it from 2006, all the way forward. But in this context, the net financial position, the amount of money that the city has access to in the broad sense, compared to the amount that it has liabilities for, so that would be pension obligations, that would be a lot of other longer-term debt, all of those sorts of things, means that the city is now in a negative net financial position at present. The difference between your financial assets, your cash, your receivables, money that's set aside in reserves, all of that compared to the amount of debt and pensions that it has. So how much you have in your piggy bank versus how much is on your credit card bill. And the staff of the cities were excellent to point out, the thing is, this is just the beginning of the exploration, because this accounts for even funds that are restricted, funds that the city doesn't have immediate access to, funds that are already pre-committed. And so if we look at the available funds that the city has to pay down its challenging deficit or the challenging burdens that it faces to make payroll and do all of those things, it's actually even more significant. And this is the first city staff that I've come across that have said, hey, I know that you've described a picture in which things are really challenging. The reality is even more challenging, and I want to applaud that. That is so vitally necessary to grapple with this. We talk about this from the context of one of our campaigns at Strong Towns for transparent local accounting. It's making visible the challenges that we face in our communities. And this is a core element of it. And so the city is in a compromised financial position. And the way in which that has emerged is your assets, the amount of assets that you have on hand just are not matching up to the greater number of liabilities that you face. And in that context, if you've been a student and you rang up some extra debt on a credit card, you know that you have either got to work harder, or you've got to save more, or you've got to do a combination of both. And the city, for many years, for political reasons, and again, this is not against any political person, the city for many years has simply said, we've got to do the second. Cut expenses, and maybe a little bit of the first, earn a little bit more, but taxes are tough to justify, so we're just going to continue to run barer and barer as we go. We're going to sidestep our obligation to keep up our roads and our streets and all of the other things that we have in our arsenal. We're just going to limp along a little bit longer. But the challenge is then, if for every, basically just over $1.50 that you have of actual assets in the city, including all of your infrastructure, you owe $1. That is really difficult. That means those dollars that you've invested in your infrastructure needs to really earn its keep, because it's very costly to the city to have that. And so the challenge that you face as well is that, this is the last of the charts, I promise, the current value of the city's physical assets compared to their original cost. This is the one that's very common. Many cities are grappling with this. Your net book value, so what it initially cost, compared to the cost of tangible capital assets, is what we're looking at here. This is, so if a road is newly paved, it's at its 100% state. So that would pull that line up. If you improve your water main and you repair it, that would pull that line up. And so all of your investments into your assets in your city, each time that you improve something and return it to a new state, is essentially resetting it to 100. The challenge is, even as growing amounts of public money is going out the door to fix stuff, you have an even greater amount of things. Matt, remember that image I showed you of San Antonio's roadways? For every 4 miles that they've successfully repaved in a year, their 100 miles have aged even more rapidly. On a year-by-year basis, they're falling behind and behind and behind. And your city has hills to deal with. Your city has to get poop up and down hills. You have to get water through those same spaces and not have them meet each other. You have to figure out ways to keep buildings open, lights on, staff employed, and in that context, you're trying to do so with the exact same, virtually the same tax base that you've had before, including a population decline in the area. Oh, I said it was the last one, but it's not quite. Government transfers to total revenue as well. This is another one where this will help you feel a little bit better. Just under 10% of your annual revenue comes from government transfers. So you get money from property taxes, you get money from other sources of revenue, but you also rely for every $10, one of those comes from a higher level of government. Does that make you nervous at all, or is that totally fine? In Fargo, it's 40% of their annual revenue comes from government transfers. In San Antonio, it's just over 25%, which surprised me. It kind of as a Canadian, I have assumptions about certain states. That surprised me about North Dakota and Texas, but it actually kind of didn't surprise me in California, because we know there have been significant financial pressures in the state of California, and so we can see a lot of that transfer revenue coming in, beginning to fall off. And the question is, what happens if the wells go dry at the higher levels of government, if they grapple with an inflation crisis, or if they grapple with the introduction of higher interest rates, or whatever that might look like, is a challenge. Ever so quickly, 57 minutes, all right, 3 minutes. We've got, this is a really helpful comparison in the city of Cochrane, so north of the Canadian border. But what they looked at is they said, hey, we're doing new development in our downtown area. This is on the other side of the tracks. So the big brand new stuff with the best minds and the best construction techniques and the best well-financed individuals doing this work, they've come up with a pattern of development that is 3 times as productive as what they have in the rest of the city, where it's low-slung residential development. So you say, okay, you've created a new heartbeat within the community. The trouble is that heartbeat is not as vital as what our ancestors built. And it's not because these are remarkable structures. You can see the purple there and you think, oh, that must be a tower or something. No, that's just that little one with the triangular roof over there. These are simple, modest structures that a bunch of pioneer hicks, and I can say that as the son of a dairy farmer, a bunch of pioneer hicks built buildings like that. But they sited them close together. They made opportunity through proximity rather than what the automobile made possible, which is dilution. The automobile, in order to accommodate its size and girth, requires you to spread everything out. The human, just moving around in the community, does really well with proximity, does really well, and businesses do better, and many different participants do better. Each of these spaces, the found books and shop, is nothing remarkable, but it returns more on a per hectare or per acre basis than all of the new stuff that is being added to the community. And so the challenge that we have is that we're in the midst of an infinite game. A finite game, like a hockey game, is 3 periods and an overtime. You throw in your best players at the start, you tell them to work their butts off. They work their butts off for 3 periods, maybe they go to overtime, they finish the game, and then they get to reset. And if you're a coach, you know this. If you had a bad game, you're like, oh, thank the Lord that is over. Now we're gonna retool and be ready. Cities don't get that reset. We don't get to put everything back to where it was and then try it again. Instead, we're in the midst of an infinite game, and so our strategies are different. One, we have to conserve scarce resources very well. That means being very discreet about when people say, hey, what if the city just funded this, to say we can't, or we need to be very careful about this. A second element of it is we should welcome the introduction of new resources. If you've ever been in a charity, not curling match down here, but say a charity baseball game or softball game that goes on for hours and hours longer than it should, in that context, you're happy if an extra person shows up. You're happy if an extra participant says, I'm willing to be part of what you're doing, because I will bring that extra energy, I will bring that extra capacity. And this is what we mean when we say that we allow our neighborhoods to thicken up. That's the equivalent of adding an extra player when you're gasping in the 18th inning of your softball game. And so in an infinite game, you must have a surplus more available in most years than strictly needed. I'll close with this, and then we'll go to questions. At Strong Towns, we've been asked, what are the core things that we need to be doing? And I know I've run long on a few slides. So in this context, I want to close with this, because this is something each of you can take with you, apply it as you observe your community, and take note of the first step of any public investment process, especially when you have very little, or you need to make very good use of very little, is to humbly observe where people in the community struggle. And it's easy to sort of kind of quickly do this, but we say go for a walk. Walk with someone in your community that is struggling in your neighborhood. Say, what is a small thing that we could do right now to address that struggle? Our cities are so often locked in a process of study, delay, do another study, fight about it, do another study, delay, and then ultimately try to act, but the act no longer meets the need. Instead, we say, do that thing right now. We have seen cities that said, hey, we had a consultant and they told us that we probably should do something about our curb cuts, the spots where if you're a blind person, you would just walk off onto the street. Instead, we need to create ramps. So we need a ramp making strategy. I was just up in Chico. They've just sent out work crews with asphalt and said, make ramps. They don't need the strategy. They said, where is somebody struggling? We're just going to go and fix that struggle. We see this with bike lanes all the time, and I don't want to overly complicate things by talking about bike lanes in certain audiences. Bike lanes, people are always like, you get a bike lane or you get parking. So often we can actually just move where the vehicles are parked, narrow the travel lanes ever so slightly, and now we've got a gutter lane that people who are running, people who are pushing strollers, people that are on scooters, they can all use that so we have less conflicts on our sidewalks. We have large enough streets that we can redeploy these public spaces really well. And that's what we talk about. Identify what is the next smallest thing that we can do. And this can be a citizen-led effort. This is something that staff can do. This is something that we can do as a community together. It can look like $10,000 planting a bunch of trees so that way pretty soon the bus stop that everybody has to wait at in order to get transported down to the BART, to make sure that it is more dignified, that it feels a little bit fresher, a little bit lovelier, a little bit more cared for. It can look like identifying, is there a way that near an elementary school, we can just make sure that at any point where we think children are gonna cross the street, that they're very visible through some great daylighting or great curb bump outs. Do it with garbage cans from Home Depot and fill them with soil. Put a plant in it and give everybody a little bit of joy, but at the same time reorient the expectations that we have about our places. And when we do this, this is how we build stronger communities. And so Pete, I'm gonna, oh man, I've got so many. Oh, last one. This is my favorite. All right, last thing is, don't fight congestion. What causes congestion is people stopping. So on the 101, if people need to slow down, you're gonna get backup. And if they need to stop, then you get crazy backup. But for a city, you don't want it on the highway. You want the highway's purpose is to move people through. But in our towns, in any of our retail areas, we actually want that. Again, like, ever since the first business person decided to set up a brothel or a saloon, they want people to stop. And then the priest comes along and is like, can we also have a church for the same purpose? And so one of our considerations is that the price of a great place is congestion. But the benefit of congestion outside of the size and girth of a vehicle is that it's a lot more manageable. In fact, it can be a little bit more delightful. People walking together in a street festival, people coming together for a farmer's market, are a demonstration that congestion creates opportunity through proximity. Closeness is not the enemy. Dilution is the problem, and we're paying the cost for it. So with that, I'm going to pause, as I've promised to 5 times now. Thank you so much, and let's take time for question and discussion. Thank you.